Mama, I'm scared.
Shh, it's okay, baby. I won't leave you. I'll do anything for you.
I know.
The rain was soft, almost like a whisper against the windows, but it did nothing to quiet the storm in Julia's heart. She sat by the bed, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's forehead, the fever still burning. Her little girl, Lily, was restless, her small body trembling with the heat. Julia's heart ached, watching the way Lily's tiny hands would clutch at the sheets, seeking comfort, but too weak to find it. Julia had been awake for hours, the darkness of the night stretching on endlessly. Her own body cried out for rest, for sleep, but she couldn't leave Lily, not when she needed her the most. A mother's love isn't measured by the amount of rest she gets or the ease of her days. It's measured by the quiet, steadfast commitment to being there, to endure, even when every part of her was exhausted. She had always been the one to soothe Lily in the middle of the night when the nightmares came, the one who kissed away scraped knees, the one who tucked her in every single night with whispered words of love and protection. Now, as Lily burned with fever, Julia did the same. She stroked her daughter's hair, soothing her with a soft voice, though every word felt heavy, like a burden she couldn't bear. "Mommy's here, sweetheart," Julia whispered, her voice tender, even though it was hoarse from lack of sleep. "You're going to be okay. Mommy's here." Lily's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, her hand weakly reaching up to Julia's face. "Mommy, I'm scared." Julia's heart twisted. Scared. The one word that had the power to undo everything she'd fought for. She could feel it, the ache of knowing her little girl was frightened, knowing she was the one person Lily trusted to make everything better, and yet, she felt powerless. She was only human. "Sure, it's okay, baby. I won't leave you." Julia's hand brushed over Lily's forehead once more, trying to cool the heat of her fever. She had no medicine left, no money for more supplies, and all the doctor's visits were far too costly. She knew the truth. Time was running out, and there was little she could do. But Julia was a mother, and a mother doesn't give up. Not ever. She leaned down, her lips brushing her daughter's forehead, and whispered through the tightness in her chest.
I'll do anything for you.
I know.
"I'll fight for you." In that moment, the truth of it settled deep within Julia. She would go to any length. The love she felt for her child had no bounds, no rules. She would sacrifice her own life, her own peace, to keep Lily safe, to see her well again. This love, fierce and unyielding, was a bond no one could break. And it does pay off. And life returned to normalcy in their own way, where Julia will work 2 jobs, struggle to provide for her kids' education, pay bills, and make sure they survive. Then it happened 2 months to her children's promotional exams. Julia fell sick and was left to God's mercy and to her own fate. Just as she lay there glancing at the hospital papers, bills, and the heart-wrenching note from the doctor, 48 hours or treatment stops. She broke down in tears. "What will happen to my little babies?" Meanwhile, just across the room, Ethan and Eliza, the twins just 5 years old, barely old enough to understand what life means in itself, but they only knew one thing.
Mummy is all we got. We must look for help. And we will save our mummy.
The morning sky was heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The rain that had begun softly the night before now fell harder, steady and relentless, soaking everything in its path. Ethan and Eliza stood at the massive gates of a mansion, their small bodies shivering against the cold. The sound of their breathing was barely audible over the falling rain, but their hearts beat loudly in their chests, as though their very souls were screaming for help. Ethan, the older of the two by only a few minutes, stood at the front, his shoulders squared, trying to look brave. His face was pale from the sleepless nights he'd spent worrying about his mother. The papers he carried, tattered and bent from being clutched so tightly, flapped slightly in the breeze. His little fingers wrapped tightly around his sister's hand, squeezing it with a silent promise. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "What if they won't help? What if we're too late?" Eliza, ever the more composed of the two, turned to him, her wide, brown eyes steady but full of unspoken fear. She didn't answer immediately, instead glancing up at the towering gates before her, at the security cameras blinking silently above, and at the pristine walls of the mansion that stretched endlessly on either side. She tugged on his hand gently, bringing him closer. Mommy said the biggest gate means the biggest help. We have to try. She spoke with the kind of quiet certainty only a child could, her trust in their mother's words unshakable. She looked up at the gates again, squinting slightly as the rain blurred the edges of her vision. He has to help. Mommy is waiting. We can't go back without help. Ethan's heart clenched at her words. Mommy is waiting. He could feel his throat tightening, the weight of the words heavy in his chest. He didn't want to let his sister down. He didn't want to let his mother down. They had already tried everywhere else. Every door they knocked on, every person they asked for help had turned them away. And now, here they were, standing before the gates of a man they had never met, but whose name had been whispered to them by a stranger on the street. A man who was rich, a man who could save their mother. As Eliza spoke, her voice steady despite the fear that clung to her like a second skin, a guard appeared from behind the gate, his boots loud against the stone as he approached. "Hey, kids," the guard said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of authority. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan took a step forward, lifting his chin in defiance, as if that small movement could make him taller, stronger. His small body trembled from the cold, but his voice did not. "Please, sir, our mommy is in the hospital. We need help." The guard hesitated, his gaze flicking from the rain-soaked children to the brown envelope Eliza held tightly in her hands. She clutched it with both hands now, as if releasing it would unravel everything they had left. The envelope, creased at the edges, worn from the countless times they had opened it, held the last chance for their mother. Inside, the papers were marked with urgent letters, the doctor's note that read, 48 hours remaining. If the treatment isn't paid for, it stops. We can't help her anymore. The guard took a step back, glancing at his watch, clearly uninterested in the plight of these two small children. "This isn't the place," he muttered, turning his back to them. "You need to leave." Eliza, unyielding, took a small step forward. "Please, we don't need food," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Just help our mommy stay alive." The guard froze, his shoulders stiffening. It was as if the weight of her words held him in place, and for a fleeting moment, something in him wavered. But just as quickly as it had come, the hesitation was gone. He turned, his gaze hardening again as he lifted his hand. "I said leave. Now." Eliza's heart broke at the finality of his words, but she didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached down, gently taking her brother's trembling hand in hers, her small fingers wrapping around his with quiet strength. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. But Eliza only nodded, holding his hand tighter as they watched the gates slowly begin to close. And then, just as the heavy iron gates began to shut between them and the only hope they had left, a voice cut through the rain. "What's all this noise about?" Alexander Hale stepped out from behind the glass doors of his mansion, his sharp gaze cutting through the downpour as he surveyed the scene before him. He was a man accustomed to power, wealth, and influence. At 33, he had built an empire, one that fed thousands, that built schools, that provided medical care for the less fortunate, but always from a distance. He gave his money, his resources, but never himself. He was untouchable, and he liked it that way. Now, as he saw the two small figures standing before him, drenched in the rain, clutching a torn envelope in their hands, he felt a strange tightening in his chest. His suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished, and his watch alone was worth more than most people's homes. He was untouchable, after all. The world bent to his will. But these children, they were a different kind of problem. They didn't just ask for money. They asked for something deeper, something more personal, and it was that, more than anything else, that caught his attention. The guards, seeing him approach, immediately straightened. "Sir, these children refuse to leave," one of the guards reported. Alexander's eyes shifted to the twins. Their clothes were old, worn down, the kind of clothes that screamed of poverty. But their eyes, those eyes, told him everything he needed to know. There was desperation there, yes, but there was also something else. A quiet, unwavering determination. He felt a flicker of something in his chest, something foreign, something he didn't quite recognize. But before he could place it, he pushed it away, focusing instead on the problem at hand. His voice was firm, cold, and unfeeling as he addressed the twins. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "Our mommy is in the hospital," Ethan replied quickly. "She's very sick. She needs help." Alexander sighed, rubbing his forehead. He had heard it all before. The stories, the pleas, the desperate people knocking on his door. He was a philanthropist, yes, but there was only so much one man could do. And he couldn't help everyone. "I donate millions every year," he said, his voice flat. "I can't help every sad story." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he saw it. Ethan, small and fragile, falling to his knees on the ground. His face crumpled as the weight of their last hope disappeared in front of him. His sobs echoed in the silence, and Eliza, ever the protector, dropped down beside him. Her small hand wrapped around his, steadying him. "Please," Ethan begged, his voice cracking. "Our mommy, she's all we have left. Please help." There it was again, the tightness in his chest. The flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or regret. Alexander wanted to turn away, wanted to dismiss them like he had dismissed so many others, but something inside him held him there, rooted to the spot. And then, in that moment, his eyes fell on Ethan's wrist. The mark, the birthmark, a small, curved flame that matched the one he had carried all his life. If you're feeling moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps us grow and share more powerful stories like this one. The world seemed to pause around Alexander as he stared at the small birthmark on Ethan's wrist. His breath caught in his throat. The identical curve, the flame-like shape, so unmistakable, burned into his mind like a scar he had long since buried. For a moment, the noise of the rain, the distant hum of cars on the road, and even the voices of the guards faded into nothing. All that remained was the steady beat of his heart and the unexplainable connection he felt in his chest. A connection that felt impossible, yet undeniable. He blinked hard, trying to shake the feeling. It couldn't be. It had to be some kind of coincidence. He had buried that part of his past, had buried it deep, because it was too painful to face. Yet, here it was, staring him in the face in the form of two 5-year-old children. "Where did you get that?" Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper, though he hadn't intended it to come out that way. Ethan, still on his knees, looked up at him with confusion. I was born with it," he said, his voice trembling. His tiny hand dropped to his side, the birthmark now visible against his pale skin. Alexander's legs weakened, and he caught himself on the gate. His breath was shallow, his body tense. He could feel a knot form in his throat, something pulling him back to a time he had long since locked away. His mind was spinning, flashes of memories crashing into him like waves. Clara. He closed his eyes, steadying himself, but the memories wouldn't stop. He saw her face clearly now, as if she were standing right in front of him, and he felt the weight of those years press down on him. Her laughter, her gentle hands, the moments they had shared before everything had unraveled, the love they had shared. But more than that, he felt the weight of the promise he had made to her. A promise he had broken. "Sir, are you okay?" Eliza's voice was small but steady. She looked up at him, her eyes full of worry, the same eyes that reminded him so much of Clara's, those deep, knowing eyes that could pierce right through him, even now. Alexander cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. His thoughts were racing, but his outward demeanor remained calm, too calm. He took a small step back, his eyes still locked on Ethan's wrist. "No," he muttered to himself, shaking his head as if trying to shake away the impossible truth that was settling into his chest. "This can't be real." The guards stood back, exchanging uncertain glances, unsure of what was unfolding before them. Alexander had always been in control. Always. But now, as he stood in front of these children who carried a piece of his past with them, he realized how little control he had over his own fate. He felt a cold sweat on his brow as his hands began to tremble. "This isn't how help works," he said, his voice a little too sharp, as if trying to convince himself that he was still in control of the situation. "There are systems, foundations, procedures." But as he said the words, they felt hollow. The foundations, the wealth, the power, none of it seemed to matter anymore. These children, standing before him, had broken through all his defenses. They were everything he had once wanted, and everything he had turned his back on. Ethan stood slowly, wiping his tear-streaked face with the back of his hand, and Eliza reached for his small, trembling hand, squeezing it tightly. Our mommy, she won't wake up. The doctor said she has only 2 days left. Eliza's voice cracked, the words heavy with truth. Alexander's heart clenched at the sound of her words. 2 days. He wanted to turn away, to close the door and retreat to the safety of his perfect world. He had built this life, this mansion, this empire. He had earned it all, or so he thought. Yet, standing here, in front of these children, he felt like a stranger in his own life, disconnected from everything that truly mattered. His mind flashed to Clara again, and the guilt came crashing back. He thought of the promise he had made to her, the one that slipped away with his ambition, the one he had let die as he walked away from everything he once held dear. I can't, he whispered, his voice breaking. I can't fix this. It's too late. The words hung in the air, but they didn't seem to land. Ethan and Eliza stared up at him, their small faces full of hope and fear. They didn't understand the weight of his words. They didn't understand that he had walked away from the very things that would have kept him anchored. All they understood was that their mother was dying, and they were out of time. The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension, and for the first time in his life, Alexander didn't have an answer. He didn't have a solution. He didn't know what to do. And then, something inside him broke. Eliza, Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Do you think he'll help? Eliza didn't answer right away. Her small face was a mask of calm, but the tiny trembling of her hands betrayed her emotions. She squeezed her brother's hand tighter, and for a moment, it felt like everything in the world depended on that single connection between them. Mommy said he would, she replied softly, her voice barely audible. But there was a quiet strength in her words, a belief that carried more weight than any amount of money or power could ever provide. For the first time since they had arrived at the gates, Alexander felt something shift inside of him. He looked at the twins, their desperate eyes full of trust and hope, and he couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of responsibility that settled in his chest. They were right. His wealth, his foundations, his success, it all felt meaningless in the face of this. He turned slowly, facing the gates once more, and spoke to the guard at his side. Take them to the hospital, he said quietly, his voice still shaky. Pay their bills. All of them. The words felt foreign as they left his mouth, but once they were spoken, he couldn't take them back. This wasn't just about charity anymore. It wasn't just about throwing money at a problem. This was real. These were his children, his flesh and blood, and he had failed them before. He wasn't going to make the same mistake again. As the guards led Ethan and Eliza toward the car, their faces brightened with hope, their small hands still gripping the crumpled envelope, and their hearts full of the fragile, fleeting belief that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. But as they walked away, Alexander remained standing by the gates, his eyes fixed on the spot where they had stood. His mind raced, but one thought kept repeating in his mind like an echo. This isn't over. It's just beginning. The rain had not stopped. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. But inside the sleek, luxurious car that carried the twins away from the mansion, the storm felt distant, as if it existed in another world entirely. Eliza sat with her back straight, her face still pale, but her eyes sharp and determined. Ethan, on the other hand, was curled up against his sister, his tiny hands clutching the envelope as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The car was warm, and the seats were soft, but neither child seemed to notice. Their minds were not on the comfort of the car, nor on the polished windows through which the world outside passed by unnoticed. Their minds were focused solely on their mother, on the fact that they were running out of time. As they drove through the city, past the towering buildings and busy streets, Alexander Hale stood in front of the gates of his mansion, his mind a swirl of confusion and guilt. He had made a promise to himself, to Clara, and now, to these children. But as he watched the car disappear into the distance, his chest tightened. What am I doing? He thought. The words he had spoken, offering to pay their bills, to help them, felt like a mask, a shield against the truth he had long denied. He had done what was right, hadn't he? He had provided the money. But that wasn't what they needed. It wasn't just about money. The real truth, that deep, aching part of him, was that these children, their mother, represented everything he had buried. They were the echoes of a life he had abandoned. She had no guarantee that their mother would be okay, but she had to believe it. She had to. For both of them. "We're going to help her," she finally said, her voice steady, though her own heart was trembling. "We'll make sure she gets better. We have to." The words sounded hollow in her own ears. She knew they couldn't do it alone. She knew that nothing in this world would be enough to undo the damage that had already been done. Meanwhile, Alexander had retreated to the study, his thoughts still spinning. He had given the twins what they needed, or so he thought. The money, the resources, it was the right thing to do, wasn't it? But something gnawed at him, an uncomfortable truth he couldn't shake. Except that wasn't true. He did owe them. He owed them more than he could explain. And that, more than anything else, terrified him. The minutes passed in silence, thick and heavy with the weight of his unresolved thoughts. The hum of the mansion's air conditioning filled the room, but it did little to calm his racing mind. He stared out the window, the rain pelting against the glass, the world beyond looking just as dark and uncertain as his own heart. The memories of Clara came flooding back now. He had tried so hard to shut them out, to bury them beneath layers of work and wealth. But here they were, as clear as day, crashing into him with a force he couldn't ignore. Clara, her face, her voice, her laugh. He could still hear it, like a distant echo in his mind. He could still feel her touch, that soft caress on his arm as they lay in bed, dreaming of the life they would build together. They had dreamed of children, of a family, of love. And then, just as quickly, it had all shattered. He had walked away. He had chosen ambition over love. He had chosen wealth over family. And now, here he was, confronted with the consequences of his choices. As the car neared the hospital, the twins grew quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Ethan still held the envelope tightly against his chest, as if it were the last thread of hope connecting them to their mother's survival. Eliza glanced out the window, watching the city pass by, and felt a pang of guilt. She knew their mother had done everything for them. She had worked so hard to make sure they were happy, healthy, and loved. And now, here they were, begging for help. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They were supposed to take care of her, not the other way around. But life didn't always follow the rules. The car came to a stop in front of the hospital. The twins stepped out quickly, the cold air biting at their skin. The sound of the rain hitting the pavement echoed in the silence, each drop a reminder of how much time they didn't have. They hurried inside, the warmth of the hospital a welcome relief, but it couldn't erase the fear that clung to them both. They were on their own now. He had buried it. He had buried her. And now, as these children stood before him, the past he thought he could outrun was catching up with him. I have to fix this. I have to make it right. If you're moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us keep creating emotional stories like this one. Tell us where you're watching from and join the conversation. Your engagement means everything to us. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Eliza's small hand gripped Ethan's as they walked through the sterile, white-lit corridor. Every step felt heavy, as though the weight of their mother's fate was pressing down on them. The soft murmurs of doctors and nurses seemed distant, muted by the thundering pulse in their ears. "We're doing the right thing, right?" Ethan whispered, looking up at Eliza, his voice full of doubt. Eliza, though just as scared, didn't let it show. She nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "We have to. Mommy needs us." They arrived at the nurse's station. Eliza didn't waste any time. She stepped forward, her voice strong for her brother's sake. "Excuse me, sir, we need to see our mommy. She's very sick. The doctor said she only has 2 days." Eliza's eyes darted to the clock on the wall, her mind ticking through every possible outcome, while Ethan stared at the floor, his foot tapping nervously. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Alexander stood before his grand fireplace, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. The mansion was eerily quiet. He was used to silence. It had always been a comfort, a space for him to think, to plot, to achieve. But now, it felt suffocating. He had made the decision to help the twins, but in the solitude of his study, he realized it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. They were standing at the edge of his past, his children, the ones he had abandoned long ago. And though he had brushed it aside for years, the weight of his choices now hung like a storm cloud, one he couldn't escape. "You're a coward," he thought bitterly to himself. "You gave them money, but what did you give them?" He closed his eyes, the weight of guilt settling heavily over him. The same guilt he had felt when he walked away from Clara. The same guilt that had never gone away. He had abandoned them all. "Our son will be brave," he had said, "and our daughter will be kind," she had replied. He could still see her face so clearly, as though it had been etched into his memory. "You were wrong, Clara." The thought echoed in his mind like a painful refrain. He hadn't been strong enough to stay. Back at the hospital, the minutes stretched on, each one heavy with anticipation. Ethan's mind raced, cycling through the same worries over and over. What if the doctors couldn't save their mother? What if they had run out of time? What would they do then? Who would take care of them? They had no family. No one left. Eliza squeezed his hand again. She didn't have answers, but she was trying to be the rock he needed her to be. She had always been the quiet one, the steady one, but she was still just a little girl, fighting her own fears. Finally, a doctor appeared, a man in his late 30s, his face stern but kind. He walked toward them, a clipboard in his hands, his brow furrowed with concern. "You must be the children of Julia," he said, his voice soft, but with an undertone of urgency. "Yes," Eliza replied quickly. "Please, can you save her?" The doctor sighed and took a moment before answering. "We've done everything we can, but we need immediate treatment. If we don't get the funds for the procedure today," he let the sentence hang in the air. It was clear. They were running out of time. Ethan's face went pale. 2 days. The words replayed in his mind like a terrible mantra. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice shaking. "What if we can't get the money?" Back at the mansion, Alexander sat at his desk, his hands clutching the sides of his chair as if trying to hold himself together. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. His thoughts were pulling him in every direction, yet one thing became clear to him in that moment. He couldn't stand by any longer. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. He wasn't sure where the sudden determination came from, but it was there now. This was more than just money. This was more than just a gesture. He was a father now. He had to face the past he had abandoned, and he had to do it for them, for the children, for Clara. In that moment, as the twins sat in the sterile waiting room, a call came through to the hospital. It was a simple message, one that would change everything. Alexander's voice echoed down the phone line, steady and firm. "I want you to pay for everything. Every bill. Immediately. And tell the children. I'll be there." The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind only the damp scent of earth and the rhythmic drip of water from the eaves of the hospital building. It felt as though the world had been washed clean, but inside the sterile walls of the hospital, time seemed to stand still. Ethan and Eliza sat together in the small, uncomfortable waiting room, the envelopes still clutched between them. The sounds of the bustling hospital, nurses' footsteps, doctors' conversations, distant beeps of monitors, seemed muffled, as if they were in a world of their own, separated from the chaos of reality. They were waiting for something, anything, that would give them hope. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes focused ahead. She wasn't crying, though her heart felt like it was breaking. She refused to show weakness, even though the weight of their mother's condition was too heavy to bear. Ethan, however, couldn't hold it in any longer. His hands were trembling as he fiddled with the edges of the envelope, tears welling up in his eyes. "Eliza, what if we're too late? What if?" Eliza turned to him, her small face softening, though she still kept that firm resolve in her eyes. "We won't be too late. We have to believe. Mommy said we should always have hope, even when it's hard." Ethan wiped his eyes, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill over. He wanted to be strong for his sister, but it was getting harder every minute. They had been running on nothing but hope for so long. What would happen when that hope ran out? Outside, In the waiting car, Alexander sat in silence, staring out the window. He had ordered the hospital to cover the costs, but that wasn't enough. Not by far. He had tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing. After all, he had given them what they needed. Money, resources. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. The gnawing emptiness in his chest was louder than ever. He knew that, and that's when it hit him, the realization that it wasn't about what he could do for them from a distance. It was about being there, truly being there. I've been running from this for too long, he thought, his mind racing. He was the one who had walked away all those years ago. He had been so consumed by his ambition that he couldn't see the wreckage he had left in his wake. And now, the past was coming back, and it was asking him to face it. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping the door handle. Without thinking, he stepped out of the car, his footsteps echoing in the silent night air as he walked toward the entrance. His heart beat faster with each step. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the inevitable to happen. He had to do more. He had to be more. For them. For Clara. He had promised Clara once, a long time ago. They had promised each other that they would never leave each other. He had broken that promise. Inside the hospital, the door to the twins' room opened. Eliza looked up, her gaze unwavering, and for the first time in a long time, hope flared in her heart. A nurse entered, followed by a man who stood in the doorway for a moment. His silhouette was strong, confident, and as he stepped into the room, Eliza recognized him immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. "Alexander," she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. Ethan's eyes widened as he turned to look at the man in the doorway. "Dad?" he asked, the word coming out soft and unsure, almost as though he didn't believe it himself. Alexander's face softened as he looked down at the two children, their faces a mix of surprise, fear, and hope. His heart clenched with emotion he had long since buried deep within himself. Seeing them standing there, looking so small, so vulnerable, made the weight of the past hit him with full force. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. His eyes moved to the bed where Julia lay, her fragile form barely visible beneath the blanket. "I should have been here sooner. I failed you. I failed your mother." Eliza looked up at him, her face full of questions. "But you're here now." For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room, the weight of Alexander's words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm here now," he repeated, the words heavier than any promise he had ever made before. "And I'll never leave again." Ethan, still confused, stepped forward. "You mean you'll stay with us?" "With Mommy." Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to their level, his gaze softening as he looked into their eyes. His voice was low, full of emotion he could no longer contain. "I'm here to make things right," he said, his words raw and full of sincerity. "I'm here for you, for your mother, for all of us." For the first time in what felt like forever, a sense of peace began to settle over the twins. It was a fragile peace, one that could be shattered at any moment, but it was there, a flicker of hope in the storm that had defined their lives for so long. And in that moment, Alexander realized something that shook him to his core. The twins weren't just seeking help. They were seeking love, acceptance, and the family that had been torn apart years ago. And he had failed them before, but he wasn't going to fail them again. As the doctor entered the room, his face was still serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We've started the treatment, but we'll need your consent for a few more procedures to save her," he said, turning toward Alexander. "The costs are significant, but we'll do everything we can." Alexander looked at the doctor, then back at the twins. The responsibility was clear, heavier than ever, but now it was his to bear. He nodded. "Do whatever it takes." The doctor nodded, and before he left, he gave them a small, hopeful smile. As the door closed behind him, Alexander sat down beside the twins. He wasn't sure how long it would take, how much more they would have to fight, but for the first time, he felt like he was fighting alongside them, not just for them. The room was still, but the air had shifted. There was a new sense of possibility, even in the face of the unknown. Alexander looked at the twins, and for the first time, he truly saw them, his children, his family. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said softly, his voice cracking as he looked at them. "But I promise I'm here now, and I'm never leaving." If you're moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Join us in this journey of redemption and tell us where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and together we can bring more powerful stories to life. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the machines, the steady rhythm of life that felt both fragile and determined. Julia lay in the bed, her face pale but peaceful, the effects of the treatment beginning to show. Her breathing had steadied, the fever that had once raged within her now under control. But there was still a long road ahead. As Eliza and Ethan sat together on the side of the room, their hands clasped tightly, a weight was lifted off their small shoulders. Their mother was still alive, and that, for now, was enough. But beneath that fragile hope, something else simmered, a deeper, unspoken question about the future. What would it mean, truly, for their family to come together again? Alexander sat in the corner of the room, his back straight, his posture still regal, but the tension in his jaw, the furrow of his brow, betrayed the emotional storm that had been raging inside him. He had kept his distance, as he always had, watching from the sidelines. He had given them money, had promised to cover the bills, but this was different. The real truth, the connection he had with the twins, was something he could no longer ignore. The more he looked at them, the more he saw it. The familiar tilt of Eliza's chin, the deep brown eyes that were a perfect match to Clara's, the way Ethan carried himself, even in his moments of weakness, with the same quiet strength Alexander had seen in himself when he was younger. It had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, but now it was undeniable. These children, his children, were not just the product of his past. They were his past. His choices, his mistakes, and his abandonment had brought them here. And now, as he sat in this sterile room, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had tried to escape, he realized something monumental. They weren't just his children. They were his redemption. They were the proof that it wasn't too late to change, to make things right. But he couldn't just buy his way into their hearts, couldn't throw money at the problem and expect it to go away. He had to be there. Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are we going home soon, Dad?" he asked quietly, the words still new on his lips, but it held an undeniable truth. Ethan was no longer unsure. He had called him Dad, and it felt real, like the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Alexander's heart clenched at the sound of the word. It wasn't just the title, it was what it meant. It was the admission that everything had been wrong for so long, and that this moment, this small, fragile moment, was a step toward something real. Toward family. "I think, yes," Alexander replied, his voice softer than usual, cracking slightly as he finally met Ethan's gaze. "We're going home soon. But we need to take things slow. There's a lot to rebuild. But I promise you, I'll be here this time. I won't leave again." Eliza, still holding Ethan's hand, looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and cautious optimism. "You promise?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her little face unsure, but full of that childlike belief in the impossible. Alexander's throat tightened. He had failed them once. He couldn't do it again. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes, I promise." His voice was firm, resolute. As the days passed, Julia's recovery was slow but steady. Each morning, Alexander would visit her, sitting quietly by her side, holding her hand in a way he hadn't done in years. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic speeches, just the simple act of showing up, being present, in a way he had neglected for so long. But it was enough. One evening, as the sun began to set and the soft glow of the fading light filled the mansion, the small family gathered in the living room. The twins had grown accustomed to their new surroundings, the mansion now feeling less like a foreign world of wealth and isolation, and more like a home where love, not wealth, defined the walls. Ethan, who had grown quieter in the past few days, suddenly ran to the piano in the corner of the room, his small fingers grazing the keys with curiosity. Eliza, ever the observant one, watched him for a moment before following. Alexander stood nearby, watching them with a soft smile. He hadn't seen them so at ease in so long. He had always thought of his life in terms of what he could achieve, what he could build, how much he could provide. But in this room, surrounded by his children, he realized it wasn't about the mansions or the money. It was about the small moments, the laughter shared over a game, the quiet comfort of sitting together, the sense of belonging. He knelt down beside the piano, gently placing his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "What do you want to play?" he asked, his voice low. almost as though he were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that hung between them. Ethan glanced up at him, his expression serious but calm. "I want to play for Mommy," he said, his small fingers still dancing over the keys. "She likes music. She said it makes her happy." Alexander's chest tightened. They were already becoming a family. Eliza stood next to her brother, watching him with admiration, her tiny hand resting lightly on his arm. "Mommy is going to be so happy," she whispered, as though the very thought of their mother smiling was enough to carry them through. And as Ethan began to play a soft, simple melody, one he had learned from watching his mother play in the past, Alexander found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he had to fix, what he had to achieve, or how he could make up for lost time. For the first time in years, he was simply present. And in that moment, it was enough. The following weeks passed with quiet moments of healing and rebuilding. Julia's strength returned gradually, but with each passing day, the house felt fuller, richer, not with wealth, but with love. The small family found their rhythm again, and Alexander, who had always been too caught up in the weight of his ambitions, found himself learning how to be with them, how to live with them. Each day, he spent more time with Ethan and Eliza, playing games, talking, and, most importantly, being the father they needed him to be. He began to show up for them in ways he had never done before, attending school events, helping with homework, and, most notably, simply listening to their hopes, fears, and dreams. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, laughing over a silly story Eliza had told, Alexander looked at his children, the same children he had once abandoned, and realized something profound. He had missed out on so much. But now, as he looked around the table at the family he had once walked away from, he knew that this was the life he had been meant to live all along. His eyes met Julia's, her smile soft and tired but full of warmth. She reached out, squeezing his hand beneath the table, and in that moment, all the mistakes, all the years of regret, seemed to fade away. They had rebuilt something here, something that could never be measured by wealth, titles, or success. It was love, it was family, and it was real. As we come to the end of this powerful journey, let's take a moment to reflect on the deeper themes of the story. The road to redemption, healing, and rebuilding isn't an easy one. It's often filled with regret, heartache, and the weight of past mistakes. But through every twist and turn, one thing becomes clear: giving up is never an option. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how broken you may feel, there is always the potential to rise again, to rebuild, to find redemption, and to heal. The journey of Alexander and his children teaches us that love, in its truest form, requires action. It's not just about providing or offering help from a distance. It's about showing up, being present, and taking responsibility for the things we've lost or walked away from. It's about showing up not just in the good times, but in the moments when life is tough, when the weight of the world feels unbearable. This story reminds us that family, in whatever form it takes, holds the key to healing. It's in the small, everyday moments of connection, of listening, of showing compassion and understanding. Even when we feel we've made too many mistakes, or the past is too painful to face, the love of those who care for us can bring us back from the brink, piece by piece. But perhaps the most important lesson here is this: it's never too late. It doesn't matter how long we've been running from our mistakes, or how far we've strayed from the people we love. As long as we have the strength to face the past and the courage to take the first step forward, we can begin to rebuild. We can reclaim the love and the relationships we thought were lost forever. So, to all of you watching, I want to leave you with this. No matter what you've gone through, no matter what obstacles lie ahead, remember that you are never alone. Your mistakes do not define you, and the choices you've made in the past don't have to control your future. Hope is always within reach, and there is always a path forward, even when the road is unclear. Life might not always go the way we plan, but that doesn't mean we stop walking. Keep going. Keep fighting. Don't give up. There is always hope. If this story has touched you and inspired you to keep moving forward, then make sure you subscribe to our channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who may need a reminder that hope is never lost. Let us know where you're watching from and what you think about this story. Your feedback and support help us grow and continue bringing you these powerful, emotional journeys. Thank you for being part of our community. Let's keep going, together. Stay hopeful, stay strong, and remember, giving up is never an option.